So, what are the choosers, right? These are the people in Rawls's in Rawls's original position, which is his interpretation of the initial situation. Which, again, remember, people in this tradition of social contract have different starting points. They take the initial situation and they give it different spins. Rawls's spin gets us into his original position. Again, we haven't specified much about that, just that they're all under this veil of ignorance. So what would they pick? Not the principle of utility, as I mentioned in the previous video, but he thinks they would pick two principles, and these two principles he gradually introduces over the course of the book. And actually, you don't get the full stated principles until much later in the book, but he introduces them and starts to flesh them out. So always be careful with Rawls and philosophers in general. They all do this. They'll introduce something, and don't take it too seriously at first. Take sort of the general idea, because they're going to start fleshing it out and they're going to be tweaking and modifying as they go along. Rawls does that. As a matter of fact, he gradually introduces these principles in 5 stages. Right? So don't just grab the first one and say, okay, this is what Rawls means, and then criticize it or run with it and say it's great. So check this out. Stage 1 is in part 1, chapter 1, section 3, which is where we are in the main idea of justice. He just kind of tosses it out and says, hey, here's what they'll kind of look like. I haven't told you what they really are yet, but we'll get to that in a sec. Stage 2, he'll refine it a little bit more. That's in the next chapter. In section 11, then he'll refine it again in stage 3, and he's not refining everything, he's refining parts of these things. So this gives you a little heads up that these two principles are going to have little parts in them, so he's going to tweak and adjust them as he goes along. So stage 3, yep, you've got another adjustment to different parts of it. Stage 4, you have to wait quite a while. That's now in part 2 of the book, so way down the line. Chapter 4, section 39. So the sections run, I think there's 87 sections in the whole book. So that's a way you can think of it. Section 3, then section 11, then section 13, and then we jump to section 39 for stage 4, the fourth sort of tweaking of these principles that would be picked by the choosers in Rawls's original position. And what are they choosing? They're choosing the principles that constitute justice. And hence, that's why the book is really called A Theory of Justice. He's working the whole thing out in excruciating detail, like it or not. So stage 4, yeah. So now you're down to section 39. So several, like 36 sections later, he's on part. Finally, right? Section 46. This is a couple hundred pages later. So we're going through several sections, lots of discussion, lots of economic theory as well that's embedded in here as a result of Rawls's decision for his original position to take advantage of the concepts from rational choice theory. So it's good to go. Maybe you head over to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy or look for a video from me on rational choice theory. It helps you to understand a lot of what's going on in the book, A Theory of Justice. So this is several hundred pages in by the time you actually get his final statement of this. So way down to section 46. Okay, so in an upcoming video, I'll talk a little bit more in detail, but I'm not going to go into all the details of Rawls because it's got a lot of economic theory involved. But we'll get a better idea of what Rawls is about. Here's our first idea. Think about this. Rawls, it's sort of the big background is that, remember when I was saying that Rawls says, okay, those initial choosers, they're going to dig their heels in. Rational, free-thinking individuals are individuals. They're going to dig their heels in about something, right? Namely that I'm not going to enter into a society, I'm not going to agree unless the justice of the concept of justice in that society guarantees me some basic stuff. Okay, that's a fundamental intuition that Rawls thinks that these choosers and everyone else would carry into this discussion. So even if I took away all of your identity as much as I could and said, okay, what kind of society would you like to live in, or would you agree to live in? you probably would say something like, there should be basic kinds of rights that nobody can take away from me. I don't forfeit them, right? I have certain kinds of fundamental rights. And so that's really the first kind of little principle. We haven't unpacked it, but just this sort of intuition is like, look, there's got to be some basic rights. There's got to be some kind of egalitarian bedrock or underpinning that it doesn't matter who you are. You can't get rid of them. Nobody can give them to you. Nobody can take them away. They're inalienable. They're just part of the structure of the entire show. So this egalitarian principle, this is sort of a principle of equality. I'll think of it that way. That would be the first thing that Rawls thinks that people would want, right? That would be the first kind of agreement they would come to. The second, Rawls would say, and this is where Rawls, shows he's kind of a small L liberal kind of guy. He's certainly, he's certainly no strong, let's say, like in terms of political, he wouldn't be like, communist or socialist where he wants to level everything. And of course, those terms are so debated these days. But Rawls, if we think of it this way, Rawls is saying that the choosers wouldn't want to flatten everything out. They would just want to flatten out that beginning part, those fundamental things. So there would be an underlying egalitarian bedrock, but there would be certain things that we would agree are going to be unequal in society. That, hey, look, some people, let's face it, Rawls says that we're not all born the same. We're pretty close in lots of ways, but some people just are driven a little bit more and they end up making more money and they study harder, they work a little harder, and sometimes, and Rawls freely admits, there's just so many privileges that are totally undeserved. What do you do about that, right? And you're kind of stuck with this. So you're stuck with inequalities. They're just going to come up, whether they're kind of semi kind of quasi-natural inequalities, like some people are more driven to do stuff and other people are a little calmer about things in life. However you want to put it, we're just not all the same. And so there's going to just be inequalities. But we want to make sure that we all have basic rights, that we're all the same in that sense. Like, we're all equal in the eyes of the law or stuff like that, even though it doesn't always work that way. We would be choosing principles that say that we are. But there's going to be different. Some people are driven and they want to become a prime minister or a president. Not everybody is like that. And not everybody who even would have the opportunity to do it would do it. And some people will fight their way through lots of adversity, etc., etc. So if Rawls has got you this far, what he's got you into saying is that, for the most part, I want a bedrock of equality, and I accept that there will be some social and economic inequalities, but I don't want those to be just rampant. I don't want those to get out of hand. And as we know, equalities are funny little things. They tend to breed more inequalities. If you allow inequalities into a system, you've got to be careful, because we know full well that inequalities, often gets a society into long-term troubles of, concentrations of wealth and power. And in the end, that leads to political troubles and unrest. And it's in the end, it's not that good for anybody. And certainly it's going to be a lot worse for some people and not so bad for others. But you want to try to control how bad discrepancies can become. So inequalities are not ruled out, but if you're going to allow for inequalities, there has to be principles of justice that regulate them and mitigate sort of the sting of them. And there is a sort of a sliding scale, like we like to say, that, people that are they're doing really well, okay, fine. And you can hear sort of Rawls's notion of, you can hear kind of a progressive notion, not in the sense of necessarily politically progressive, but certainly in the sense of like graduated tax schemes. Like, if you're doing really well and you're making lots of money, you're going to pay a little bit higher of a proportion of your income into a tax system than some guy who's making or some woman or whatever who's making a lot less than you. So the bite, not just the bite in total, but the percentage bite is going to be a little bit harsher as you go up the economic scale. But since you're doing so well, hey, you can afford it, and it's going to help. And if we tone it down as we go down until we hit points where we say some people that are under a certain income level, they don't have to pay any tax, but they get to benefit from the system. They still get to take advantage of social programs, right? They still get to use the roads even if they're not paying taxes. We would say, well, that's kind of fair. Those people are in a rough situation. So when you go further down and on the socioeconomic, on earning power, you cut these people a little more, a few more breaks. So this idea of a sliding scale with respect to inequalities is part of what Rawls also thinks we would do. So we have the firm bedrock, and then there's some inequalities, but we want to have it also where people that are making a lot of money are paying into the system and help to rising tide sort of floats and raises all boats kind of idea. Don't take that too seriously, but that's roughly the concept behind it. So a bit of a sliding scale. Now, as I said, Rawls is going to refine all this. This is just, notice I'm waving my hands a lot. He's going to tighten this up a lot. And as you see, he's got a number of opportunities to do it. So, and Rawls, sorry, I keep saying Ross. Rawls also admits that not everybody's going to buy this, right? Like, there's going to be a lot of people that just don't accept this. But he thinks that he's offering something important, namely, and he says this over and over again in The Theory of Justice and in other writings, he wants to find a solid, respectable, preferable option to utilitarianism, right? So he's always taking shots at utilitarianism in this book. Not consequentialist forms of thinking per se, because remember, Rawls doesn't think that, the initial choosers, they wouldn't be thinking of rules or principles and not regarding consequences at all. Rawls is very clear that consequences are important in moral thinking. You bet. You would pick your principles of justice by saying, okay, well, think about, something like this regarding inequalities. Well, we don't want to let those get out of hand because those can cause all kinds of troubles down the line. That's a consequentialist form of thinking right there. And that's fine, according to Rawls. So he's not a deontologist in the strict sense the way Kant is, where Kant, no matter what anybody tells you, Kant wants to get rid of all consequentialist lines of thinking, right? So remember, for Kant, it's all about a conceptual framework, and it's regarding the destruction of concepts and semantics, not consequences that lead Kant to say certain things are immoral. Rawls isn't like that. He's got consequentialist thinking, certainly. But nonetheless, he's going to refine all this as he goes along, and he thinks that utilitarianism, so Rawls stops and then gives a couple shots at utilitarianism and perfectionism. Let's start with his shot at utilitarianism. He thinks, and I've mentioned this earlier, Rawls just thinks that utilitarianism, at the end of it all, makes it possible to justify, right? Not that it could happen. Rawls says that utilitarianism can justify, make it just, or at least give you a just in terms of its own, internal to its own theoretical formulation. It can make a just argument for bartering away rights, kind of moving them around. And Rawls has an interesting story of what he thinks is sort of this ideal observer that underlies utilitarianism, and kind of like the way we say, well, right now I'm going to deny myself some treats, and I'll reward myself later. And Rawls says that the utilitarian tends to look at the notion of the progression of history kind of analogous to the progression of and the development of an individual, where I deny myself now to reward a later self, tomorrow or whatever. So we can deny certain rights here and there to compensate now for what happened before or to adjust them towards the future. And Rawls does not like this idea, not when it comes to basic kinds of rights. He thinks that this is a real problem and when you get into treating groups in a certain way over other groups, etc., with respect to certain basic rights. In other words, Rawls doesn't mind it in certain ways because he allows inequalities, but he does not allow for those fundamental things to be shifted around. And sort of his parting shot and you can think of this as a little tagline for Rawls, is that he says utilitarianism does not take seriously the distinction between persons. In the end, it kind of glosses it over the way that you might gloss over a distinction between your current self and yourself tomorrow, because it's all connected. And so, it's sort of compensating, oh, my poor self, don't worry, poor present self, you will be awarded tomorrow in your future self. But since it's all part of the same self, it's not really that bad. It balances out. Does it really balance out when you do that regarding groups and across persons? And Rawls says not with respect to fundamental rights. It doesn't take those seriously as a deontological constraint. So in that sense, he's a deontologist. It is right that individuals cannot have certain kinds of basic rights taken away under any circumstance. Perfectionism relies on a certain notion of what it is to be a human being. It's got a teleological underpinning, so you can kind of like McIntyre, so that's more of a McIntyre type line. And Rawls just wants to stay away from this whole notion of essence and whatnot. But of course, he's kind of got one when he talks about his choosers and his interpretation of the original position. It's saying, what's fundamentally the most important thing? Well, it turns out, not surprising, it's a certain model embraced by rational choice theory economics, which is not terribly far from the traditional philosophical notion of saying the essence of a human being is to be a rational soul. So in that sense, Rawls might have a kind of sneaky perfectionism underlying it, but nonetheless, he thinks that doesn't, and he wants to put that to the side. So Rawls says that his theory of justice, and I'll just finish up with this, is it's part of a larger theory. He says that his theory of justice is part of a larger theory, namely the theory of rational choice. So he's trying to embed himself in a history, social contract history, history of economics, rational choice theory. That's he thinks is important. It's not complete. It's limited to the basic structures of society, and I've talked about what he thinks those are in earlier videos. So it's not about the whole society. He's only concerned with one virtue, the first virtue of society, namely justice. He's not talking about all other virtues and only about the basic structures of society. He doesn't touch upon relations, really interpersonal ones, nor with the environment, nor with animals. And he says this could all be quite heavily changed if someone comes along and redoes this. And remember, it's also with respect to an insulated or an isolated society. And it's a fundamentally kind of liberal society. So there's lots of restrictions on this under which Rawls develops his theory. But even though, despite all those restrictions, he still has a lot to say. And we'll see what more he has to say in the next video.